Next we're gonna hear a performance by Lea Urpa. She comes from University of Helsinki, and she's gonna tell us how to use animal models to study such a complex thing as psychiatric disorder.
The first thing that when they ask the researchers what they say, is what you study anxiety. The first thing that people ask the researchers are, well, what do you know? What have you found out? Tell me. And the second thing is, well, how do you study something as uniquely human as anxiety in mice like me? So I'm here to tell you how mice and humans are maybe not as different as you might think they would be, and they can maybe have some behaviors that are we can have some behaviors that are very similar to the things that you guys experience as anxiety. But in order to understand that, first, well, the question is, why do we study anxiety? Like, everybody knows what anxiety feels like. Why do we really need to study that? So let's go back a little bit about how humans have thought about anxiety in the past. So in the past, people have thought that the ancient Greeks used to think that mental illness was something that was supernaturally inflicted when you did something bad that displeased the gods. And with the spread of Christianity, that morphed into something like angelic or demonic possession and kind of resulted in the witch hunts, 200,000 people dead. So they started to think that maybe that was a bad thing, to think of it that way. And then it became, when they started to realize that it wasn't a supernatural phenomenon when people had mental illness, it was something that actually came from a natural perspective somehow, and they had some little crazy ideas, like, the stone of folly. Mental illness came from a stone in the brain that had to be removed surgically, like in this painting here, so maybe not so much. So we can laugh and go, old humans, they used to have such, silly ideas about mental illness, but we know much better things about it today. But, as recently as the 1960s, they thought it would be a good idea to put an ice pick behind your eyeball and sort of scramble a little, and that would help something like bipolar disorder, which turns out maybe not so great. And there's actually some recent evidence that sort of one of our favorite drugs, Paxil or Prozac or whatever you call it, depending on what country you're in, might not actually be as good for people that have sort of mild depression as we thought it was. And even though lots of people are prescribed this drug, it turns out it might actually not be as useful, and might be more useful only for people that have really bad depression versus, say, like cognitive behavioral therapy or some kind of talk therapy. So, and that sort of is, the idea is that the ability to have really good medicine that we have nowadays comes from that research. Once you know what's going on in a system, you can really change it to make things better and make these diseases go away. And a big part of that, of this evidence-based medicine is what it's called, it comes from this clinical, this research experience, this research evidence that we have. We've got some idea at least of what's going on, and then we can change it to make it have better treatments. So, now that we've talked about that, we can talk about how similar. Well, for example, anxiety. We're going to talk about anxiety and how it's very similar in mice like me and humans like you guys. So, anxiety and fear are a normal response that happens in dangerous situations. When you have, for example, getting on a stage and speaking in front of 150 people, or when you have accidentally checked into the Bates Motel and you've got someone with a knife. So it's a behavioral response that happens in response to dangerous things happening. It's a good thing. Like, you can imagine in the past when there was a lion trying to eat you and you ran away. That's, the ones that went, freaked out and ran away. So what happens is you start to speak faster. All of a sudden everything seems very clear. Your breathing gets deeper somehow, and you start to be very aware of your surroundings when you have this response. And so what's really happening in the brain? We know a little bit about it, and I'll outline some of the details, some of the general things, not any details, just some general things about what happens in the system. So you have this response. It's called this stress response in your brain, and it happens exactly what I said. You have all of these responses that you feel as being really anxious, and what happens is that stress circuitry in your brain activates, and then you start to have these adrenaline and cortisol surging through your system, right? But it turns out this whole system and these hormones that go through your body when you're feeling anxiety are genetically encoded. And it turns out that genetic encoding, because it's something that happens to every organism, right, is actually really similar among different species. So in humans like you guys, primates, mice like me, amphibians, and reptiles. It's all very similar, the genetic encoding, right? So, well, the thing about anxiety is even though it's genetically encoded, it's not something simple like eye color. Eye color is something that's determined by maybe 2 or 3 genes, so that we know of. So it's very easy to tell, like, you can, I don't know, if you're a biologist and you're on a date, you can figure out, you know, what color eyes your kids would have if you got married. So, but versus something like tallness, which is what we call a complex genetic trait. Tallness is something that's really, really heritable. Like, if your parents are tall, you're probably going to be pretty tall. If your parents are short, you're probably going to be pretty short. But there's not 1 or 2 genes that determine tallness. There's many, 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 many genes that all contribute a really small proportion to whether or not you're going to be tall or short. It's still heritable, but there's a lot going on, so it's a really complicated system to figure out. And anxiety and most mental illnesses are something like this. So, what makes it even more complicated is humans are so diverse. Right? There's incredible amounts of diversity in any kind of population. And, you know, they really don't like it when you, like, ask them if they can sit in a room for 12 years while you observe them. So, it can be kind of difficult to study humans because of stuff like that. But it turns out mice like me, you know, they've got a genealogy back generations and generations. They know exactly who your parents are, and they've done genomes of many different breeds of mice that are all available online for free. And because they're a little bit easier so they're more similar to each other we are, it's easier to study us. And so, one example of how we do this is something called the light-dark box. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a box, and there's a light side and a dark side. And mice like us, we like to be, we're nocturnal, so we like to be in the dark side of things. So, it feels more safe. So a mouse that's more anxious will stay a little bit more on the dark side of the box than they spend on the light side of the box. Whereas a mouse that's more brave and, like, really likes to go out and adventure will spend more time on the light side of the box instead of the dark side of the box. And you can look at these behavioral differences and then look at the genetics and see maybe there's some variation here, like this has some variation in this gene and this has some variation in this gene. So we can actually look at the differences between the genes and say, hey, maybe there's something going on here. And because these genes are very similar between humans and mice, we can actually take these genes and see if we find the same genes in humans that have anxiety. And we have some really good population data for something like the Fin 2000, Health 2000 study. We've got some really good data of people that have anxiety, and we have genetic information for them, so we can start to tie together the stuff that we have from the mice and the stuff that we have from the humans. And why is this important? I mean, it's cool to know, like, which genes are what, but really, what a gene is. Can anybody tell me what a gene is? Anybody have any idea what a gene is? I mean, it's a word that, like, you know, we're in the age of genetics and everything like that, and it's a buzzword, but does anyone know what a gene actually is?
A recipe for proteins?
A recipe for proteins, exactly. Thank you. From another geneticist. So, what a gene does, everything in your body is made of proteins. Everything that you see that makes up you is made from a protein, and the information for making that protein comes from a gene. So we can actually use this information to see, okay, if this gene is different in someone with anxiety, and it's different in the mice with anxiety too, it's probably important for anxiety. So we can figure out what protein it makes. And then after we figure out the protein, we can actually see how that interacts with the stress system. And then from that, we can actually start to tailor treatments to people. So we can actually have more treatment advances in people that have really, really bad anxiety or other disorders. And that's why we do research in mice like me.